All right, we are recording. This is the night before Thanksgiving. This is just this book study. We're going to be starting on page 77 tonight. A happy run downward. And before we get started, as usual, is there any old business? Anything from last week? Anything that you've been thinking about? Want to bring up and kick around before we dive into new stuff? Okie dokie. Oh, for a second there, I thought Jerry was going to say something.
No, I'm good. I was
Yeah, okay.
rereading real quick, but I'm good.
Pre-reading, you can't jump ahead. That's not
No,
allowed.
no, I said I was rereading,
Rereading, okay.
not
Okay.
pre-reading, rereading.
Yeah. So we're just getting started in the third section, and this is the major heading is suffering and surrender. So we're obviously in the this is going to be the third section that we read in chapter 3, or the third section. All has that theme to it, all talking about. And we've run into this before with Richard Rohr. We're going to be hitting it hard tonight. Um, his concept of a necessary suffering, that great suffering and great love are the paths by which we enter into transformation. And so he's going to be making another case for that tonight. And we've had some folks that have pushed back pretty hard on that notion. So let's see how this strikes you tonight. So a happy run downward, page 77. Both St. Francis and St. Clare let go of their fear of suffering, any need for power, prestige, and possessions, and any need for their small self to be important. So they came to know who they really were in God, and thus who they objectively were. Sorry. Such a profound ability to change is often the fruit of suffering and various forms of poverty, since the small self does not surrender without a fight to its death. If we understand suffering to be whenever we are not in control, then we see why some form of suffering is absolutely necessary to teach us how to live beyond the illusion of control and to give that control back to God and the flow of reality. This counterintuitive insight surely explains why these two medieval dropouts, Francis and Clare, tried to invite us all into their happy run downward to that place of poverty and the powerlessness where all of humanity finally dwells anyway. They voluntarily leapt into the very fire from which most of us are trying to escape, with total trust that Jesus' way of the cross could not and would not be a wrong path. By God's grace, they believed that they could trust the eventual passing of all things and where they were passing to. They did not wait for liberation later after death, but grasped it here and now. Okay. Thoughts, initial reactions? Anything jump out at you?
So when they say poverty, they mean no money, no nothing. They lived with no money.
With Francis and Clare, yes, they took it very literally.
Wow.
Yeah. But for us, it's going to be more metaphorical.
Okay.
All
Thank
right.
you.
But yes,
I'm not
for
willing to
for
live in poverty.
yes, Francis and Clare took it very literally.
Okay. And they felt that that was the only way that they could find liberation is to be poor.
Yeah,
Is
they
that what
they
you're
felt
saying?
that that was where they would be closest to Jesus Christ if they were poor. Since he lived in poverty, he was an itinerant, as far as we know in the Gospels, didn't own anything. At least it's not stated that he owned anything.
Hmm.
You know, then that they thought that was the way to imitate him the closest, to take them into the state of being completely aware of dependence and vulnerability. Did I say independence? I meant dependence, to be aware of their dependence and vulnerability, and to reveal to them their true selves and the true nature of their relationships all of that through poverty. Now, in reality, we don't really know. Jesus had a home in Capernaum, that there it is referred to as his home. Now, how that is his home, is anybody's guess. Um, there's no indication that Jesus was married, certainly. He's always been understood as being unmarried, but that would be very, very unusual for a Jewish man. He still had his mother alive, and so he had a household that, being the eldest, if his father had died, if Joseph had died, then he would be responsible for the family. So it's unclear, what the actual living situation was for Jesus, but it seems that he did have a home in Capernaum. So how does that relate to his poverty? It's more difficult. But traditionally, Jesus was a poor itinerant. The line that, foxes have their holes and birds have their nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head, was always used as the indication that he didn't own anything. So, but that can be taken different ways too, interpreted different ways. But yes, in fact, if we go back, do you know, you probably know the contour of Francis's life, most of you, right? You know that he was born into a very wealthy family, and his father was a wealthy merchant, and so Francis was the son of of opulence. He was a playboy. He was a party boy, leading kind of the typical life of first generation of a entrepreneur and a self-made person. And it wasn't until he went off to fight in the war, which were little skirmishes between city-states back then in Italy. Not the kind of war we're typically thinking of. But he went off to fight the war. He was wounded. He became very ill. He was taken prisoner of war. And in the experience of that, he had a change in his attitude. And then when he had his first vision in the broken down church of San Damiano, that's when he really turned his life completely around. At that point, when he saw the vision and Jesus was asking him to rebuild his church, he thought he literally meant rebuild the broken down structure of San Damiano, which he started to do. But in the process of that, he renounced everything that his birthright with his father. And, that famous scene, supposedly, in the courtyard where he takes off all of his expensive clothes, strips down, and renounces his family and his wealth. And then from that point on, he's living as a pauper, begging for food and begging for support and all of that. And then he is attracting followers at that point. Well, Claire also was born into a very wealthy family. She was the eldest. She had two younger sisters. She had a very, very devout mother, and her mother taught her and her sisters about, her Christian formation and instilled in them a real devotion. And it turns out all three sisters entered the convent, much to the father's chagrin. He was trying to marry Claire off at age 12 to another wealthy young man. And she said, no, I don't want to marry until I'm 18. And she kept pushing it off, pushing it off. But then as her 18th birthday was approaching, first of all, she heard a sermon that Francis gave. They were both in the Assisi area, and she was deeply moved by that sermon and deeply influenced by Francis and his spirituality. He was about 13 years older than she. So before her 18th birthday and before she would have had to have been married, she runs off and Francis helps her, and they shave her head, cut off all her hair, which was the symbol of a woman moving into a religious life. And she entered a Benedictine monastery, a convent at that point. And so she got out from under her father's house. Her two younger sisters followed suit. And in fact, her third sister, who took the name Agnes, is also canonized a saint. So she and Claire are both canonized saints. And then her mother, after her father died, also entered the convent as well. So all the women of the family ended up in religious life, and two of them were canonized. But it's interesting because they were both very wealthy. So The ones that really responded to Jesus' message were the people at the margins, which is what you would expect, right? The marginalized, the disenfranchised, those who are already poor. Um, it would be a lot easier for them to be able to find themselves in a place to accept their vulnerability because they've had to do it their entire lives. But here you have two very privileged individuals finding their way into that place of poverty. And Claire is really interesting. She is the first woman to have actually written a rule, a monastic rule for her order. First woman to ever put such a rule in writing. And so she was a kind of a pioneer in that respect. But her rule was absolute, abject, and strict poverty. Absolutely no ownership of anything whatsoever. And that rule of poverty was what brought them close to Christ. And after Frances died, she kind of lost some of her backing and some of her covering. So she had to try to keep the order going on her own and had to go to the Pope to try to maintain the rule that she had for her house because they kept trying to moderate it. And as she got older and her health was failing, Pope, I forget which one, Innocent the Fourth or something, who really cared for her, wanted her to relax the rule of poverty just so she could maintain her health better. But she wouldn't budge, and he finally acquiesced and put that rule in place. And then after she died, her order, which was called the Poor Ladies, was changed to the Order of St. Clare. And but to me, the interesting part here is that you had two wealthy individuals who were able to make that transition, not just into metaphorical or spiritual poverty, but actual physical and financial poverty as well as the rule of their lives. And obviously, the Franciscans aren't the same Franciscans that they were at the beginning when Francis was alive. There's a lot of wealth accumulated in the Franciscan order at this time. So they're taking it more metaphorically now as well. And actually, Richard Rohr bemoans that often in various places in his writing, where the Franciscans, aren't following Francis's rule as closely as they were at the beginning. So,
But I
You
was
know what's you know what's funny? The vows of poverty too. You know, the Hindu yogis and the Buddhist monks take that vow of poverty.
mhm,
They get their food just by asking for alms. Not funny?
That's not funny.
No.
It's kind of obvious. Um, when I joined the monastery of the order, there were three vows: chastity, poverty, and obedience. That was our three vows. So chastity, obviously, you don't marry as a religious in the Catholic Church. Poverty simply meant that you didn't have any personal ownership. There's nothing attached to your name, but obviously the order took care of you. You wouldn't want for anything, but you also didn't own anything either, specifically. The the rule that was difficult for me at the beginning was obedience. Yeah, that was a tough one. You know, had to get up at this time. You had to go to bed at that time. This is what you had to do at this point and that point and every other point. And back in the day, I had a bit of an authority complex myself. So yeah, obedience was a difficult one at that point. But those are the three vows, and they remain the same. You know, and
So
yes,
so so I read Siddhartha years ago, and he was also a very rich family.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And he went through the same curve that we're talking about here with Francis and Claire. Absolutely. He was a prince, supposedly. So he had all sorts of privilege, but let it all go as part of this selling of everything that Jesus is constantly talking about, right? Oh. So to go back to the top here, both Francis and Claire let go of their fear of suffering, any need for power, prestige, and possessions, and any need for their small self to be important. So, along with this idea of poverty, both material wealth, goes all of these other things at the same time. And because they're really all connected, if you think about it, the need for power and prestige and possessions. We talked about those three symbolic temptations that Jesus goes through in the wilderness. The need for relevance, power, and attention, a spectacular attention. Those are the basic drives that pretty much all humans have. In letting go of your material possessions, you're letting go of all of those as well. You're letting go of your fear of suffering. And he's got a great definition for suffering in the next paragraph. But we equate suffering with the loss of all of those things, don't we? If you don't have power, if you don't have possessions, if you don't have prestige, if you don't have respect, all those things, that is to us suffering. And so all of that self stuff is, of course, attached to the egoic sense. He calls it the small self here. And so to let go of all of that is what contemplation is all about. Well, they're doing it in a very overt way. And because of this, they came to know who they really were in God and thus who they objectively were. And I found that word objectively kind of interesting because normally we're not thinking that way, are we? We're saying, hey, no, in contemplation, it's subject to subject. You know, it's the I-thou relationship, not the I-it relationship, not subject to object. But he's talking about thus we know who they knew who they were objectively in God. And so I was thinking about that. Does that seem like a contradiction to you all? Does it?
By our standards, yeah, it is. Because for something to be objective, it has to be scalable. We have to be able to measure it, assign values to it,
Mm-hmm.
very
Mm-hmm.
discrete. And so, um, even if what we're measuring may or may not be really real, nevertheless, if we can assign some measure to it, you say it's objective.
Right, right. So I don't think he means it that way, because that just kind of takes it out of the contemplative realm. So as I was thinking about this, I think what he's talking about is he's talking about to know who you really are in God is to know who you are without any subjective illusion being attached to it. You know, our subjectivity allows us within our egoic consciousness allows us to attach all sorts of illusions and projections and all that that would be subjective. It's just our own. And I think what he means is that that gets stripped away. And so what we're seeing is the real reality, something that everybody would see with all those illusions stripped away. And I think it's objective in that sort of sense.
Mhm.
Did that help at all or just muddy the waters?
Well, aren't we? I'm struggling with this. If if we believe that we are one with God who created us, and that Jesus walks with us and is part of us, how can you not really get to know who God is? I mean, by giving up everything, that's the only way you're going to learn who God is what it's saying to me. So they came to know who they really were in God. Well, why can't I learn I mean, I've been learning who I am in God, but I haven't given everything up.
No, but you have.
I have?
You haven't given up your possessions.
Right. I mean, I didn't give up my power. Well, I don't have any power. Possessions, prestige, um, and this need for small self to be important. I mean, I get that, but I don't like this who they really were. And then later they're talking about I mean, he talks more about the self. And I have been I mean, one of my gratitudes is that I've learned that Jesus is within me and that he is part of me and the Holy Spirit walks with me. And um, so this to me says that that's not true.
No, 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 it's not saying that at all.
Well, that's how I'm reading it.
Okay.
Let me just say
Yeah.
that. Let me
Yeah.
say that I don't think I have to give everything up, my possessions, and I don't have to live in poverty to know who God is.
No,
And,
you don't. But what you do have to give up is your idea of yourself and your idea of God and your idea of Jesus and your idea of your roles and accomplishments and all of that. Everything that we accrue egoically is going to stand between us and this objective reality that
Yeah,
is
I get
stripped
that.
of all of those illusions and stripped of that need for control, right?
Uh-huh.
So
Okay.
that's what we're doing. And it's only what we've been doing in contemplation all along. I mean, the contemplation is the practice of stepping aside from the mechanism that carries all of that
Yeah.
stuff. And so when we step
So yeah,
aside from it,
my perceptions, but I'm learning the difference between perception and knowledge. I'm gaining, I believe, more knowledge in letting go a lot of my ego and perceptions of what the perceptions I had of who Jesus was and who God was. And now, have found the loving, caring God that I'm grateful for today. Does that make sense? I mean, because I had a totally different perception of God, and that I've given up and letting go of my old beliefs that I was raised with, and have slowly, through your training, through Unity, through Al-Anon, I've come to know a God of my understanding that, and it's not myself, of course, but I just don't like that sentence. I just don't like that he's saying I don't really know who God is if I don't do what they did. That's how I'm reading it.
no, that's not what he's saying.
Okay.
He's saying this is the path they took to come to know who they really were in God and who they objectively were without any of their subjective illusions or projections being present, you know. Um, but everybody hasn't done that. I mean, we can probably take a look at some figures in the Bible. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus are heroes in the Gospels um, because of where they ended up at the end of the gospel story, right? But there is no indication that they gave up their power or their prestige or their rank or their role as leading Pharisees and members of the Sanhedrin, you know. So they were fine in all of that because this is an interior journey. That's what matters.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes, as Jesus said, it's harder for a rich person to go through enter the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. The whole idea is when you have all of this stuff, it's a heck of a lot harder to separate your ego from all of that because you become so identified with it. So that's why the people that really followed Jesus initially were the people who didn't have anything because their ego wasn't attached to all that stuff. A lot easier for them to follow Jesus than someone who was rich because they had a lot less to lose. They weren't invested in the status quo and so on and so forth, right? So it's going to be a lot harder for someone. Now, all of us, by any standards, are rich and wealthy, right? And so it's going to be a lot harder for us to do this. Their solution, since they were so rich and wealthy, was to give it all up. Maybe that's why they're saints with a capital S, right? Because they were able to go to those extremes. But it wasn't literally necessary for them to do that. They could have stayed part of their wealthy families. Claire could have gotten married and still gotten to the place where she knew who God was. That just wasn't her choice. That wasn't her way of doing it. The important thing is the interior journey, but we just need to realize that while we are still identified with all the possessions that we have, then the prestige and the roles, it's going to be so much more difficult for us to be able to step away. And as we realize that, it's okay, so that's it. Can we at least then start to sever our emotional attachment to these things, even as we continue to use them as the tools that they are for our dependents and our family and everything else? Can we start to sever our identification with them so that we are no longer the job, we are no longer the role? And that is the same thing. That's the journey we're talking about.
Got it.
So,
I think I know what you mean, like saint with a little s, because I'm acquainted with a few physicians who, they have power, prestige, and possessions. I never ask about possessions. They don't show it. But the prestige, they drive modest cars. I know this oncologist, this sweet old man who drives a jalopy. And just humble, modest men and women, and they don't wield their power. They are there because they love what they do, and it's a calling. And they're the saints with a little s. And I don't know how many houses they have. They don't brag about it. But yes, you can feel that humility they have and the compassion. They
Hmm.
are here to serve others.
That's perfect, Ellen. That's exactly what we're talking about. But we
Mhm.
just need to recognize it is going to be harder for us, because we do have so much. And it's easy to get attached to these things, easier than we think. Those identities run a lot deeper than we're aware of. So, so it just means that, we're going to be smoothing the stone for a while. That's okay. Nothing wrong with that. But I think, Jerry, that you are in such a different position now than you were a few years ago in terms. So you've gone a long way down this journey, even though you're still sitting in your home. And that's okay.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I don't have to give my home up then.
You do not.
Okay,
Absolutely not. Because then we're going to have to support you somehow. We don't want to
or
do
my Mustang.
that.
It sounds like it's just really a commitment that you're making, in a sense, with whatever your surrounding is. It's a type of commitment that you're making, or a passion that you're sticking to. I guess that's kind of the way I see it. Like, I understand what you're saying, Jerry. But I like Ellen's description. That makes sense, Ellen.
Yeah, that
They
makes
don't
sense.
get caught up in it all. They stay grounded. They're sort of committed to something that's important. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so then continuing, such a profound ability to change, as we're talking about with Francis and Claire, such a profound ability to change is often the fruit of suffering and various forms of poverty, since the small self does not surrender without a fight to its death.
Amen.
That is absolutely true. Amen to that. Yeah. Okay. So what I was interested in is that, okay, it's obvious what Francis went through. He says it's the fruit of suffering and various forms of poverty. Well, Francis didn't have poverty in his experience as a young man, but he did have suffering. He was wounded in battle. He was ill to the point of death. He was thrown in a prison cell as a prisoner of war. So he did go through some suffering that led to a visionary experience, a mystical experience. Claire, on the other hand, when you read her life story, she lived in her father's house until she finally made the decision to go into a religious order. And so you know, she obviously was fed and clothed and had that. So where is the suffering there? Where is the poverty there? You know, and as I was looking at it, I think it has to do with her womanhood because of the position that women held at that time in that society. Basically women were property. And the father owned his daughter and could marry her off. That she was able to refuse until she was 18 is kind of a big deal. But the fact that she really didn't own her own life, that she was going to be moved about by these other forces and could not choose for herself, I think is a form of poverty. And I think it alters the perspective in ways that the men didn't have to deal with. So I think there's something there that may be a part of what her experience was. And then also the deep devotion that her mother had and instilled in her and her sisters at an early age, I think was also a balancing force in her life. But for whatever reason, and then meeting Francis and being so, deeply affected by him, his spirituality, his poverty, and how he went about his spiritual life. All those together um, put her into the place where she was sure this is what she needed to do and wanted to do. Um, but it was interesting as I was reading, this kind of small biography of her, and what was the suffering? What was the impetus that led her to such a monumental decision to change? I mean, that is huge. I mean, imagine that, at age 17 or so, to make that kind of decision for yourself. That's a big
Yeah.
deal.
And I'm surprised, Dave, when you're talking about her biography, that she had the opportunity to even make the decision. I mean, it sounded like her father could have just told her what to do. I mean, it meant unless it was just an uphill battle, and that was part of her suffering, where she just fought him. I don't want to get married. I don't want to marry right now. I mean, it sounds like he could have just waved his hand and said, "You're going to do this,"
Mhm.
in that time period anyway. So
Yeah,
great.
and I didn't read any explanation as how she was able to pull that off, unless, her father just loved her enough to respect that decision, that,
Mhm.
expecting that he was going to get his way eventually, if she wanted to wait a few more years. But she literally just disappeared, kind of just exited the house under the cover of night and left. And he didn't had any idea what was happening until she was gone. So it was very surreptitious as far
That's
as that
clever.
went. Yeah, you could make a movie out of that. Um, and then he has this I think really good definition. If we understand suffering to be whenever we are not in control, I like that because
Yeah.
I think that's a real key concept for us. Think about the times that you are considering yourself really suffering. What are those times? You know, it's going to be a time of loss of some sort, right? So if a loved one dies, that's suffering. What control do you have over that situation? None. If you contract a great illness, whether whether it's cancer or whether it's an injury, what control do you have? And if it's a financial loss, if the market goes south, if your business fails or whatever it may be, but all those times that we would consider great suffering are times over which we have no control. And I think the suffering really is the lack of control. We can't change this. We can't make it what we think it should be. The world is just out of kilter. Nothing makes sense anymore. How can this be? How could God allow this to be? That rage at the machine and crying into the void is all this deep sense of powerlessness and vulnerability. And that is, of course, terrifying for us. So, this idea of suffering to be whenever we are not in control, I think, is a great way to look at it. And then the the conclusion he reaches because of that definition is that then when we see some form of then we see why some form of suffering is absolutely necessary to teach us how to live beyond the illusion of control and to give that control back to God and the flow of reality. Okay. Do you think that follows from his definition of suffering being out of control, not being in control? He says, because of that, we can see why some form of suffering is absolutely necessary to teach us how to live beyond the illusion of control. So, first of all, are we ready to admit that any control we think we have is really illusion? Or at best, it's rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, right? We can move things around, but can we really change any of these big things in life? Do we have that kind of control? We can choose our path through things. At least we can choose the process, but we can't choose the outcomes. Those are outside of our control. And so the suffering teaches us, the suffering strips away the illusion. Really, that's what suffering does. Any of those losses that we were just talking about, or I was just talking about, what they do is they strip away the illusion. Suddenly we realize we don't have any control. On usual day-to-day activities and details, we can quite comfortably move through and imagine that we have all this control. We're paying the bills, the car's there, the car starts, there's gas at the gas station, there's food on the shelf. We're in control. We can manage all of this stuff. And then something happens, you know, got a pandemic. Suddenly, there's no toilet paper on the supermarket shelves anymore. I'm not in control. And we panic and we're hoarding and trying to find the paper. My gosh, one little thing can throw the whole universe out of kilter. And then we suddenly realize that control we thought we had was all illusion. Suffering is what can teach us that. And then, if we can learn to live beyond the illusion of control, that is, learn to live in a sense of poverty, learn to live in that vulnerability, then we know how to give control back to God and the flow of reality. I thought it was interesting that he kind of equated God with the flow of reality.
Mhm.
That's an interesting juxtaposition, don't you think?
Mhm.
To understand God as just the flow of reality as it actually is. I thought that was pretty cool.
Mhm.
See, that makes more sense to me. This part makes more sense to me. I can relate to this.
Okay.
I definitely can relate to this.
Hmm. So basically, what he's saying is that we don't and can't know who we really are until we're out of control, until the illusion of control that we think we wield has been stripped away. That's a prerequisite. When that happens, then we can actually come to terms with who we are as human beings, which is dependent, vulnerable, fragile, right? Not in control. We are being blown about by the flow of reality to a certain extent. And that doesn't mean that we don't have free will. It doesn't mean that we don't have choice. We can choose how we act and react. We can choose to still live by our principles that we believe and have become convinced of within all these changing circumstances over which we have no control. We can still do that. We can chart our interior course in the face of all that we can't control in our exterior course, if that made any sense.
We
This,
have to be humbled by life, is what you're saying,
what's
really.
that, Kathy?
We have to be humbled by life to
Mhm.
feel this.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And life is going to oblige.
Yeah.
Life will always humble you.
No one volunteers for it. No one's raising their hand saying, "Oh, humble me. I'll take that disease, or I'll take this loss. I want to learn who I really am." It didn't
Yeah.
work that way.
True.
Absolutely. Yeah, we may fast, we'll do some of those kind of things. We'll fast and maybe we'll simplify and give certain things away. I mean, yeah, there's obviously Claire and Francis, you know, stepped outside of some of the things that they owned. Um, and so there's some things we can do, but the big things that Brady's talking about, nobody signs up for that. And that's the good news. You don't have to sign up for that. The Catholic Church, Western Europe, got really, out in left field, where they were self-flagellating and they were wearing cilices and doing all this stuff to keep themselves in constant pain because they thought that's was going to bring them closer to Jesus as well. This super and even abusive ascetic lifestyle just really took a nasty turn. Um, so there were people who were obviously doing that, thinking that somehow earned them um, brownie points with God, earned them closeness with God. Um, there is something about staying present, and of course, pain can do that. I suppose fasting, is a way of keeping ourselves present because we're aware of the body's need for food and we're not eating and that sort of thing. Um, but I think obviously we need to be careful there. It's not the pain itself that sanctifies. It's our presence to pain that can sanctify. But we don't need to go looking for the pain. The pain will find us, and that's the difference. And you don't see Jesus looking for pain. In fact, he was getting raked over the coals because he didn't fast like the other Pharisees did, and he celebrated when they thought he should be fasting. He was called a drunkard and a glutton because he ate and drank at times when they thought he should be fasting. And when John did, his cousin, John the Baptist. But Jesus was about celebration. You know, this is the moment. And yet, when the moment came for him to suffer, he didn't shy away from that either. He had a bad moment in Gethsemane, but he came back around to it. But he didn't go looking for it. He didn't shy away from the fight either. He just stuck with his principles and kept moving down, making his choices. But the circumstances were swirling around him, and he stayed the course. That we can do. but we don't have control over the circumstances. And the sooner we learn that, the the easier we can get, or the sooner we can get to that place of a fearless vulnerability, you know, of a happy dependence. We fear those things so much because we fear the loss of control. But if we can get to this place where we realize the control is an illusion, you know, it's like we were saying before with that scene from The Matrix. Don't try to bend the spoon, that's impossible. Only try to see the truth. What truth? There is no spoon, right? Don't try to give up your control. That's impossible. Only try to see the truth. What truth? You don't have any. It's an illusion. If we can get to the point where we realize our control is an illusion, then we can give it up. Then life starts to become easier because we can settle into who we really are. We can live the humility of being vulnerable, fragile, dependent, and yet at the same time in God's embrace, which makes all the difference. This counterintuitive insight surely explains why these two medieval dropouts, I like that, Francis and Claire, tried to invite us all into their happy run downward to that place of poverty and powerlessness where all of humanity finally dwells anyway. We've been going through the 12 steps of AA on Sunday, and so where do they start? They start with an admission of powerlessness. We have to start there. Without that, we will never submit to any power greater than ourselves. And if we can't do that, then we never learn anything new. We're only going to keep rehearsing what we already think we know. We're caught inside the hamster wheel, caught inside the bubble. So that place of poverty, that place of powerlessness is always the starting place. You know, Ellen brought up Siddhartha, you know, he, same path, same realization that we have to start from the place of poverty, have to start from the place of powerlessness. That's the beginning of any substantive change. And it is our default position. I mean, that's who we are. Now, he calls it the powerlessness where all of humanity finally dwells anyway. That's who and what we are. We can pretend not, and the more stuff we have, the more easily we can pretend, but it's just a pretense. They, Francis and Claire, voluntarily leapt into the very fire from which most of us are trying to escape, with total trust that Jesus' way of the cross could not and would not be a wrong path. By God's grace, they believed that they could trust the eventual passing of all things and where they were passing to. They did not wait for liberation later, after death, but grasped it here and now. So they believed that they could trust the eventual passing of all things and where they were passing to. So obviously, he's talking there about ultimately death, you know, but even before death, everything is passing through. I mean, everything that we have is always under constant change. It's constantly mutating. And I'll tell you what, man, the older I get, the faster it seems to be passing through. Things that I thought were solid, things that I thought were going to last, you know, it's just everything is changing. I mean, even to the point that I look at our little dog who is, what, 9 years old, you know, and I realize we're only going to have her for just a few more years, or maybe tomorrow. And, you know, and it's just like we're so attached to this little dog. And yet it's just this short little tiny window of time that you have that life form you have that you share with, right? And then it's gone. Watching her muzzle turn white, watching her age, looking at myself age in the mirror. You know, people that I know are getting sick and dying, and you know, things are changing. It's like, wow, everything is passing through. You know, can we trust that even with the passing through of these things in and out of our lives, that it's still going to be okay? That as we change where we're changing to, and then ultimately death, that it's still going to be okay. How do we get to that place of trust? We first have to let go of all the illusions because that's what we're violently clinging to. That's what's keeping us separate from this deeper understanding that in our vulnerability lies our strength. What did Paul say? When I'm weak, I'm strong, right? That's what he's trying to get across here. As we let go and just admit, accept, and own who we really are, then we can actually accept the gift that's been given us, but not before.
I've always loved your discussions about liminal space. And I think I may have mentioned this before, but I think that when we grasp the impermanence of all things and truly understand what you're talking about, you come to realize that we're always in liminal space. We are always no longer and not yet, always. There's no there there. It's just things around us and us. It's just constant change.
Mhm.
So I think there's a kind of peace if you can accept that instead of struggling against it.
Mhm. The only constant is change, right? All those platitudes, they come back to you and it's like, wow, there's a reason they're a platitude because they're true. Maybe not helpful anymore, but they're still true.
Mhm.
But how do we come to a place of peace with all of that? Because it's the change that scares us. The impermanence of things scares us because now it's chipping away at our sense of certainty. And we need that in order to feel secure, but it's not there.
Well, there can be a different kind of certainty, one that's not based on the things that change, but one that's based on what's permanent.
Hmm. I call that conviction rather than certainty. But I know where you're going with that. Yes, to me, conviction is what I can convince myself of because of the experiences that I've had, but I still can't prove it to anybody else. To me, if it's certain, it should be something empirical. I can prove it, I can reproduce it. But my spirituality and existential experience is not that. But it is a conviction, and a conviction can be as good as a certainty
Mhm.
once it's yours.
Yeah.
And that's I think where you're driving at, Brady. Just a semantic thing here, but yes, I understand what you're saying. Yeah, as we accept um, uncertainty as the kind of the core of life, that doesn't mean that we're not passionate about our beliefs and our convictions. That doesn't mean that we're blowing in the wind now or everything is relative. Not at all. You know, but that what we realize is that our conviction is not going to be based on a rational concept. We didn't reason our way to that conviction. We lived our way to that conviction. And so it has a whole different quality to it.
I have a story. I got
Oh, go for it. I
I'll shut
love your
up.
stories.
I love this story. So our granddaughter Ruby was taking piano lessons way, way, way back, and I think she was about somewhere between 6 and 8. Had been taking piano lessons, and we were at her what was going to be her first recital. So Ruby's sitting between me and her dad, and we're waiting for her turn to come. And as we go through the other kids, we get close to the time where it's her time. She knows that her time is coming up, and she begins to kind of wiggle in her chair a little bit and move her legs. And I leaned over and I said, "Ruby, you're a little nervous?" And she goes, "Nope, just excited." And I'm thinking, that's it. That's it. If we can look at life that way, instead of what is, in the future and what's foreboding, but rather looking at it's like, wow, I wonder what's coming next. But I love that story.
That's great.
Great.
You're sure she wasn't lying, Brady?
Sure, sure. And we didn't have any mushrooms around either, so great.
This is what I trying to get across on Sunday when we hit the 12th step, and we talked about that, every cycle, you end where you begin, you arrive where you began, right? and you know the place more and you know yourself more for each cycle that you take. And so the ending is just another beginning. So the 12th step actually takes us back to the first step, but we're going to know that differently when we get to that point. So the first step is powerlessness. We started with powerlessness, and yet I characterize the 12 steps as a serial surrender. Well, if you're already starting at powerlessness, what is there left to surrender, right? But the truth of the matter is, when we first encounter powerlessness, when we first admit our powerlessness in step one, we don't really know it yet. We're using it as a concept to help us to end the resistance that we have and to begin the submission that we need to be able to take the next step and the one after that and the one after that. But we're approaching our powerlessness with fear. It's a desperation that we have to admit it because our lives are unmanageable and there's no other way forward for us. We've tried everything else for as long as we can. And so now we're finally going to admit that we're powerless. But as we take the entire circuit of steps and we come back to 12, at step 12, what the 12 and 12 calls the joy of living kicks in. And I think that's what you're heading at with Ruby here. She wasn't nervous about it. There was a joy of living that was part of this as she was awaiting her turn. And now the powerlessness is couched in the conviction that we are being held in God's embrace, that everything really is going to be okay. And now we can be fearlessly powerless. Now we can be happily dependent in a way that we couldn't at the first step. It just wasn't possible until we took the whole circuit. But we're coming back to powerlessness. But now we can live in a joyful powerlessness because we have this whole other body of experience that we can lean on that lets us know it's going to be okay in ways that we can't quite see.
Yeah, that's why I do the steps over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, because every time I do them, I have a new spiritual awakening. And when I get back to one again, it's like, oh yeah. So I hear exactly what you're saying, because that's exactly how it's worked for me. Is every time I come back to one, I'm like, oh yeah. And as I go through them, I get more and more of a spiritual awakening and a closer and closer to God. And it helps me let go of the illusion of control. It really does. So
Well,
I
Jerry,
did this last.
that's the poverty.
Yeah.
What we're
All right.
talking
Now
about.
I like powerlessness better than poverty.
Well,
Semantics.
It's exactly.
It's kind of like what you said in the message last week, Dave. I like when you said when we get to 12, you're now back to 1 and you're seeing all this for the first time again all over. It's like a reset sort of. And so maybe that's where you're coming from, Jerry. You start over, you have a different perspective. It's all new again, I guess. That sounds like it makes sense.
Yeah, it is. It's all new again. It really is. And it's good for me. Because then I get more in touch with that illusion of control. I can fall right back into that. I'm in control. I've got this. And then, oh no, I don't.
So you don't ever get to step 1 again and go, here we go again.
No, I start every year in January, and it's like starting the new year with, okay, remember you're not in charge, and you're not in control, and God is, and thank God He is. Today I'm grateful that God's in charge and I'm not. I am actually grateful that God is in charge, and it's not up to me anymore.
yeah, it kind of comes under the category if I've seen the boss's job and I don't want it.
Exactly.
It's like that.
It's exactly like that. Thank God I have a God that takes care of me.
And I think the final thing that happens is what he says in that last line. When we have taken this journey downward and then back upward again, we start to realize that the liberation that we are after, the freedom of knowing the truth that sets you free, we're not waiting for it. We're not waiting for it for some time when we do this, that, or the other. We're not waiting for death. It's all right here and now, or it's not anywhere ever at all. It's always here and it's always now. And that is the definition of salvation to a Jew, is spiritual liberation here and now. The freedom from fear, the freedom from illusion that allows us to be completely present and completely vulnerable and able to connect. That's salvation. That's what it is. And it all happens now. Even if it's happening later, it's always happening now.
Mhm.
Even if it
Love to
happens
hear
more
now.
later, it's always happening now.
Yeah. I love to hear now.
Yeah. All right. Look at that. Right on time.
Wow.
Well, thanks for being here on the night before Thanksgiving. I appreciate
I
that.
was
You all
curious
being
to see how
present.
many would show up. I'm impressed.
I had no idea what to expect. I knew Jordana and Scott would be here because they're always here. They're like the first ones always. But it's like, is anybody else going to show up? What's going to happen? You know, Didn't know how many more dogs were going to eat your homework. You just never know. But thank you for being here. It was a great discussion. Really, really good.
It was. And
Yeah.
thank you, Dave, for explaining and putting up with my, I don't like that.
I love when you, and usually William used to be the one.
Yeah, William's being
He's been
awful quiet
quieter
tonight.
lately. But yeah, someone's got to be the devil's advocate.
That's right. I got to be the instigator,
Thank
right?
you for doing that. Okay, Scotty.
Father God, we're grateful to be here with each other and spending this time together and spending the time investigating what you're all about. Not that we ever get a straight answer, there's always more to know about you, but we want to know what you're about and whatever we're studying this week or going through and whatever steps we're on. And we just want to know how to find you in these experiences. And in so doing, deepen our relationship with one another and with you. We're eternally grateful, Father, truly eternally grateful. There's so much that's going on with Thanksgiving tomorrow. I just pray everybody be blessed and their families be blessed and safe travels for everybody. And just thank you, God, for being with us. We love you, Lord. It's in your precious name we pray and we give our thanks and we say our amens.
Amen.
Beautifully said, Scott. Thank you.
You're welcome, guys.
Happy
Thanksgiving,
Thanksgiving.
everybody.
Everybody,
Bye,
have a good
guys.
one.
Happy
Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving. Happy to see all of you.
Pleasure, Dana. Take
Good
care
night. We'll
tomorrow.
see you Sunday.
Bye.
Good night, guys.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
See you guys on Sunday.
See you Sunday. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, George.
Bye, Dave.
Bye, William, if you're still there.
Yeah, I'm leaving. I'm always
Okay.
the last one. I'm
Have
always
a
the
good
last.
Thanksgiving, my friend.
You talking about me or you talking about William?
You, George.
Well, you too, brother.
You're the only one who's responding, so it's you.
Oh, okay. Well, happy Thanksgiving back to you,
Happy
bro.
Thanksgiving.
All right, man. We'll
Bye-bye.
talk to you later.